On a cold, gray morning in February 1944, German intelligence officers huddled around blurry reconnaissance photographs taken over the English coastline. At first glance, the images looked routine. British tanks sat along the beaches, exactly where they were expected. But something else caught their attention. Near the waterline were strange, swollen shapes, misshapen silhouettes that didn't resemble any known vehicle. Analysts argued over them for hours. Eventually, a neat label was typed onto the file and pushed aside. Canvas covers. Camouflage. Nothing of interest. They never showed the photographs to Hitler. That quiet dismissal would become one of the most expensive mistakes of the war. What the Germans failed to recognize was not camouflage at all. It was one of the boldest engineering gambles ever attempted, a plan to make 30-ton steel tanks swim. Not float helplessly on landing craft, but swim under their own power, through open sea, in waves strong enough to swamp small boats. To German planners, the idea was absurd. Tanks belonged on land. Ships belonged on water. Physics, they believed, was non-negotiable. But in workshops scattered across Britain, engineers were doing exactly that, negotiating with physics and winning. These machines were real, fully functional. Known as DD tanks, duplex drive. A Churchill or Sherman tank, once prepared, could roll off a landing craft miles from shore, sink until seawater kissed the turret, then motor steadily toward the beach while its crew stayed completely dry inside. Secrecy was absolute. Even within the British Army, only a select few knew the full truth. Crews chosen for DD training were sworn to silence. Not a word to family. Not to friends. Not even to other soldiers. The name duplex drive was deliberately vague. Some joked it stood for Donald Duck, because the tanks looked ridiculous with their inflated canvas screens raised. There was nothing ridiculous about what they represented. The entire Allied invasion of Europe depended on solving one brutal equation. How do you get heavy armor onto a defended beach fast enough to keep infantry alive? Land tanks too late, and soldiers are slaughtered. Bring landing craft too close, and German guns tear them apart. Every planning meeting for Operation Overlord kept circling the same deadly problem. Britain's answer was desperation mixed with genius. If tanks couldn't be safely delivered to the beach, then the tanks would deliver themselves. By spring 1944, hundreds of swimming tanks were ready. Their crews trained in icy Scottish lochs and storm-beaten southern beaches, learning to trust canvas and rubber to keep 30 tons of steel afloat. They practiced launching into waves, reading the sea, knowing exactly when to drop the screen and charge forward. The Germans, meanwhile, were certain Allied armor would arrive hours late. Their entire defensive strategy depended on that assumption. On June 6, 1944, that belief would be tested in the worst classroom imaginable, the storm-tossed English Channel. The lesson had been learned the hard way 2 years earlier at Dieppe. In 1942, Canadian and British troops stormed the French port with almost no armored support. It was a massacre. Infantry were cut down in seconds. Tanks arrived late, bogged down on shingle, and were destroyed one by one. The conclusion was unavoidable. You cannot take a defended beach without tanks. And you cannot wait hours for them to arrive. An infantryman on open sand has seconds to live. A tank changes everything, crushing obstacles, suppressing machine guns, giving soldiers something solid to advance behind. But conventional landing craft were a death trap. They were slow, predictable, and had to drive straight into pre-sighted artillery. Even unloading was dangerous. Too deep, the tank drowned. Too shallow, and it had to cross more killing ground. Perfect tides. Calm seas. Pure luck. No commander wanted to stake the invasion of Europe on that. By late 1943, time was running out. General Bernard Montgomery demanded a solution. Tanks on the beach within 10 minutes, or casualties would be unacceptable. Nothing worked. Until someone proposed something that sounded completely mad. A Hungarian-born engineer named Nicholas Strasler looked at the problem and didn't see impossibility. He saw buoyancy. A tank didn't need redesigning. It just needed displacement. Enough trapped air, and physics would do the rest. Archimedes had proven that centuries ago. Stroessler's solution was simple and insane. A collapsible canvas screen, supported by rubber tubes and metal struts, raised around the tank like the sides of a boat. The tank would sit low in the water, nearly submerged. Two propellers, driven by the tank's own engine, would push it forward. When Stroessler demonstrated the idea, officers laughed. Canvas holding back the English Channel? A 30-ton tank swimming like a duck? But Stroessler had done the math. A Valentine tank weighed about 16 tons. His screen displaced over 40 tons of water, more than enough to keep it afloat. On paper, at least, the impossible suddenly looked achievable. And that was the moment everything changed. And on paper, the impossible suddenly looked achievable. Now it had to survive reality. The twin propellers could push a DD tank at nearly 4 knots, slow, but enough for a beach approach. The flotation screen could be raised in about 15 minutes and dropped in less than 1, allowing the tank to fight normally the moment it touched land. Desperate for answers, the War Office approved a prototype. By June 1941, Nicholas Stroessler rolled a modified Valentine tank into Brent Reservoir in North London under conditions of absolute secrecy. If word got out that Britain was trying to make tanks swim, the ridicule would have been relentless. A small group of engineers and officers watched as the canvas skirt was raised and the tank eased into the water. It floated. Then it moved. The Valentine chugged steadily across the reservoir, turning, reversing, responding to controls like a boat. One observer later said it felt like watching a law of nature casually break. What had sounded like fantasy minutes earlier was now undeniably real. The project was immediately fast-tracked and given its official name, DD, Duplex Drive, referring to the dual system that powered either tracks or propellers. Stroessler was appointed technical director. Soon, multiple tank types were tested. Valentine's performed beautifully. Sherman's needed adjustment but worked. Even the massive Churchill could swim, though it looked utterly ridiculous doing so. Making a tank swim, however, was far more complex than the original concept suggested. There was no margin for error. A slight miscalculation in buoyancy meant instant sinking. Too little propeller power, and the tank would drift helplessly in channel currents. The DD system became dozens of tightly integrated solutions, each one critical. The flotation screen was a masterpiece of brutal practicality. Rubberized canvas stretched over metal struts formed a boat-like hull around the tank, standing nearly 8 feet tall. Inflation came from the tank's own air system, keeping the structure rigid against wind and waves. The entire assembly weighed almost a ton, heavy, but necessary to survive water pressure at speed. Propulsion came from 2 large rear-mounted propellers driven directly by the tank's engine. When swimming, the driver disengaged the tracks and powered the propellers instead. Steering worked by varying propeller speed, a slow and unintuitive process that demanded serious practice. Waterproofing proved even more critical. Every hatch, seam, and vision port became a potential death sentence. Special seals were developed. Air intakes were raised through waterproof trunking. Exhausts received anti-flood valves. The gun barrel was sealed with a canvas muzzle cover. During swimming, only the commander could see, standing in the turret, soaked by spray, shouting compass headings. The driver steered blind. The rest of the crew sat below the waterline, listening to waves slap against canvas and trusting the engineering with their lives. When the tank reached shallow water, explosive bolts fired. The struts collapsed. The screen fell away. In seconds, a floating vessel became a fighting tank again. Proving the system meant testing it in conditions close to the English Channel. By late 1942, trials moved to remote Scottish lochs, cold, deep, and often rough. Problems appeared immediately. Moderate waves sent water sloshing over the screen. If flooding outpaced the bilge pumps, buoyancy vanished fast. Several tanks sank. Crews escaped just in time, but every failure forced redesigns. Thicker canvas, reinforced struts, improved seals, bigger pumps. One conclusion became unavoidable. DD tanks could only operate in relatively calm seas. Anything above moderate conditions was deadly. That limitation terrified planners. Calm weather in the Channel was never guaranteed. Training intensified. Crews were handpicked for skill and nerves. Many were taught to swim before touching a DD tank. Launch drills moved miles offshore. Crews learned to time wave gaps, control angles, and execute the precise moment to drop the screen. Mistakes were unforgiving. Deaths during training were rare, but they happened. One Sherman flooded during a launch in March 1944. 3 men drowned. The incident was buried immediately. Then came June. The storm that delayed D-Day by 24 hours created exactly the conditions engineers feared. When Eisenhower finally gave the order for June 6th, the sea was marginal. Waves ranged from 3 to 6 feet, right at the limit. Crews knew it. The plan called for DD tanks to launch nearly 3 miles offshore, giving them about 40 minutes of swimming time. What followed would not be one story, but 5. On Sword Beach, 34 British DD Shermans entered the water. The crossing was brutal. Spray poured over the screens. Crews pumped frantically. 28 made it. 6 sank. Survivors dropped their screens just minutes before infantry landed, stunning German defenders who suddenly faced tanks emerging from the sea. At Juno Beach, Canadian DD tanks reached shore ahead of the infantry and immediately opened fire. One captured German officer later said he thought he was hallucinating. Gold Beach was worse, but most tanks still made it. Their arrival crushed pillboxes that would have devastated the assault. Then there was Omaha. American DD tanks launched farther out, into heavier seas. Orders overruled common sense. Of 32 tanks, 27 sank within minutes. Canvas collapsed. Water flooded in. Crews fought their way out, or vanished with their machines. Those few tanks that reached shore arrived too late. Without armor, American infantry were cut down in the surf. Bodies floated in shallow water. Men drowned within sight of land. The contrast with the British beaches could not have been sharper. Same invention. Same courage. Radically different outcomes. And from that difference, the real legacy of the DD tanks would be written. And the contrast could not have been clearer. At Sword, Gold, and Juno, where DD tanks successfully swam ashore, infantry casualties were dramatically lower. Across all 3 British and Canadian beaches, casualties totaled roughly 3,000 men on D-Day. At Omaha Beach alone, American forces suffered nearly 2,400 casualties, despite landing fewer troops on a single stretch of sand. The difference wasn't bravery. It wasn't equipment. It was whether swimming tanks arrived on time. So why did the British DD operations succeed while the American attempt at Omaha collapsed into disaster? The tanks were identical. The technology was the same. The difference came down to command decisions, training, and flexibility under pressure. British units had spent nearly 2 years testing DD tanks in brutal Scottish conditions. They learned, often the hard way, exactly what sea states would kill a tank crew. British doctrine was clear: if waves exceeded roughly 4 feet, commanders were authorized to cancel launches. At Sword Beach, conditions were rough but borderline acceptable. The tank commander made a critical decision: launch anyway, but from closer to shore, reducing swim time. That judgment saved lives. At Omaha, American DD crews had trained for only a few months. More importantly, naval doctrine demanded strict adherence to pre-planned launch points. When the 781st Tank Battalion commander asked to move closer due to heavy seas, he was overruled. Orders were orders. Those extra yards of open water, less than a mile, proved fatal. Without tanks, American infantry had no immediate way to suppress German bunkers. Engineers clearing obstacles were cut down by machine gun fire that should have been neutralized within minutes. The planned 30-minute breakout stretched into nearly 4 hours. By mid-morning, General Omar Bradley seriously considered abandoning Omaha altogether. Meanwhile, the contrast elsewhere was stark. At Gold Beach, British DD tanks were 3 miles inland by noon. At Juno, Canadian forces reached their objectives by early afternoon. At Sword, British troops were already fighting on the outskirts of Caen, exactly as planned. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Where DD tanks arrived on schedule, first-wave casualties hovered around 10 to 15%. Where they didn't, losses exceeded 50%. Calculated risk versus rigid planning. Judgment versus doctrine. Flexibility versus catastrophe. DD tanks continued to serve after D-Day. In late 1944, British and Canadian units used them to cross rivers in France and Germany, establishing bridgeheads before engineers arrived. These crossings lacked the drama of Normandy but proved tactically valuable. By war's end, over 2,000 DD tanks had been built. Most were eventually converted back to standard tanks as amphibious assaults became less necessary. By 1950, the DD system quietly faded from service. But its legacy did not. The DD tank shattered an assumption that had gone unchallenged for generations, that certain physical limits simply could not be crossed. Tanks were land weapons. End of discussion. Stroessler proved otherwise. His canvas screens inspired future amphibious designs. Soviet engineers developed swimming tanks during the Cold War. American forces, haunted by Omaha, invested heavily in armored amphibious vehicles. Modern Marine Corps doctrine still reflects the same principle: get armored protection ashore immediately, under its own power. Military engineering schools still study the DD program, not because it was perfect, but because it worked fast, under pressure, and through relentless testing. From concept to combat in just 3 years. That speed was possible because engineers were allowed to challenge assumptions, commanders accepted experimentation, and failure was treated as data, not disgrace. And that, ultimately, is what the German analysts missed in their photographs. They saw canvas covers because they couldn't imagine anyone being audacious enough to make tanks swim. On June 6, 1944, that failure of imagination cost thousands of lives. 30-ton steel machines rose from the channel waves. The impossible made real.